Welcome back to the podcast and today's episode with me, Johnny Pardo. Today I welcome Peter on the show and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Many things about leadership, about our values, about really living from a place of trust, empathy and service. And much, much more, I'm sure. So just a quick introduction to Peter. So Peter is the former president of Shaw Communications, shares the compelling story of his rise from modest beginnings to leading one of Canada's most influential telecommunication companies. His biography, Count on Me, reveals what it takes to build a meaningful career without compromising who you are. How strong leadership is built, not on ego, but on trust, empathy, and service. So, welcome to the show today, Peter. Glad to have you with us. So, I know we've shared a little bit about your background, a little bit about the book before we started the show today. But yeah, it'd be really useful just to hear, what were these modest beginnings from you, and how did they build you up to this being this president of Shaw Communications?
Well, thanks. First of all, thanks for having me on, Johnny. It's great to talk to somebody from where part of my modest beginnings were in England, in a boarding school in Hitchin, Hertfordshire. And I'm a Canadian, and I'm in Canada right now in Kelowna. My book is really, as you just described, it started from modest beginnings, which was my father was in the army, and I was born here in the capital city of Ottawa in Canada, and my parents were. Each of them came from families of 11. And so they both had lots of siblings. And I guess my mother was going to carry on that tradition. And after the seventh child, 7 children in about 9 years, and then traveling back to England, I found that my experience was that she was suffering from something. I didn't know what postpartum blues was or anything like that. And for some reason, it tended to be focused on me and so the environment I was brought up in was not the most positive. It was somewhat of a negative upbringing, and so to the extent that my siblings themselves, even today, say, "Wow, my mother was so unfair to you," etc., etc. But that's not what colored me. What that did to me was essentially, I don't know where it came from, whether it's divine grace or an angel, but it helped me to start looking at my own values and what I didn't feel I was a negative person. I felt I was kind of a curious person, somebody that had a lot of energy, and even though occasionally when I was locked into a closet, because I wasn't a good boy, those types of experiences started off the process. But for me, even in my young age of 4 or 5 years old, I said, I'm actually better than this. I do believe in myself. And I don't know if I frame those words, but so when we moved to England, and we were put in boarding school for about 4 or 5 years, I actually found that I enjoyed the experience of being in boarding school because I could make my own way in terms of relationships, that they kind of reinforced what were, for me, very simple kind of tools that I had in terms of like, how do you grow in terms of self-confidence by experiencing positive kind of experiences. And in the boarding school environment, it started off, it was a very strange environment. And I'd never been to a boarding school. We were eating kippers, which I didn't even like the smell of kippers. And there's about 300 or 400 young boys, and learning how to play sports and how to actually relate with students and co-students, etc. What was it like to be a boarding school working with, also existing with people who were going home to their parents every day. And so anyway, the boarding school was I'll call it the first kind of foundation that I had in terms of maybe a little bit of self-confidence and seeing a little bit of the kind of opportunities to visualize better things ahead. I remember saying to myself even that time, wow, as much as I don't have much control over my own environment right now, if I ever do, I will never treat somebody like I've been treated. And it was a promise I made to myself. And through the course of after about 5 years, we moved back to Canada. And I went back to parochial school. And as I said to you, when I came back from England after 5 years, I had a good British accent. And when I first went there, everybody thought that somebody with a British accent was kind of weak. And I said, oh my gosh, they didn't realize that in boarding school in England, it can be quite rough, and you have to kind of look after yourself. And so some of my first experiences back into Canada were people bullying me because of my accent. And so we took care of that business early on. But after about 3 years in parochial school, I went to my parents and I said, I feel like I have a vocation in the priesthood. And so, which they were delighted for. They were Catholics, and they thought, wow, we've got a son that might be a priest. So I actually did go to a Benedictine monastery and just outside of Vancouver in a small town called Mission. And it was these Benedictines, it was the Seminary of Christ the King. And again, it was an environment that was very hard at first to get used to, because it was prayers and getting up early in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, learning how to speak Latin, very, very disciplined. There were 1 month a year you couldn't even speak to each other. So there was almost vows of silence. But it was sort of that next step in, I'll call it sort of internal discipline, and learning how to both thrive in that environment, which I did ultimately, and but also to develop again further skills in relationship building, my own sort of view of myself in terms of the self-talk that I would have in those days is that I am a good person. I aspire to be a good person, and I'm modeling myself, frankly, at those days, in a way that would emulate somebody that was a good person. But ultimately, I realized that the seminary wasn't really what I wanted to do. It was, and I was getting older too, and I was starting to, we all have hormones, and when I was 17 years old, I thought I certainly looked at things differently than I did when I was 14. And so I realized that this isn't really a path I wanted, but I took away from that was, again, another kind of strata in my life of stability, another foundation in my life, another color, if you will, because not many people go to monasteries and move on. I moved from the monastery into the Air Force. And I recall basic training in the Air Force and how strict it was. But I thought, wow, this is like school. I mean, I'm enjoying this. It was thoroughly enjoyable. But one of the things that I've always wanted to do, because my mother, essentially said to me, "You're a blithering idiot, and you're not going to, you're not going to turn out to be anything good." But once I got into the Air Force and I had an opportunity to start learning and being self-directed, and to start putting some achievements behind me, one of the first goals I had was, because there was a radar technician trade, and it was considered to be the ultimate trade. You could be a cook, you could be a cop, you could be a lot of things, but you had to be successful in basic training and electronics training to get that. Anyway, I was successful. I was a successful person in my class, and I was basically the door opened for me to become a radar air technician, which meant a lot more work, a lot more training, moving to a new base to study, and basically put my mind to doing an exceptional job as a radar technician, because ultimately people's lives depend on you doing what you need to do as a technician. Anyway, another growth, if you will, the foundation is getting stronger and stronger. I left the Air Force after about 3.5 years because the Canadian Air Force was trying to downsize. And I said, you know what? I don't want to be the same person 20 years from now. It doesn't really drive me. I wanted to be motivated and driven. I was driving to something. I knew it was more than what I was getting at the Air Force. So I left the Air Force because they were asking for volunteers. And I went back to Ottawa, across the country. And I went to a company that actually really aspired to have people with military training in electronics to work within their manufacturing facility in Ottawa, that they were building telecommunications equipment for the railways, essentially. I did that for a year, and I actually brought some innovation to that whole process. But I think I'd mentioned to you that when I asked the person in this company, so what's the prognosis, if you will, for a technician here in Ottawa, like 5 years from now or 10 years from now? And he said, well, not that good. You'll be paid, $2.50 an hour. And And there's not much more than that. I went, holy doodle. I put a lot of energy into my training and everything else. So I came to a decision that I was going to move, and I had not a lot of resources. I had $50. I bought a bus ticket. I bought a book called Psycho-Cybernetics.
Hmm.
For 4 days, I was on a Greyhound bus traveling from Ottawa to Vancouver. I read Psycho-Cybernetics, and my gosh, what a profound impact it had on me. I mean, I had enough confidence at the time, but when I got off that bus, I just felt almost rejuvenated. When we talked about the the whole notion behind this was psycho-cybernetics is basically uh, visualization and goal orientation. And as a radar technician, this really resonated with me because that's what we do in radar. We set ourselves a goal, and we have a feedback loop that if the missile or whatever it is that or our plane is off course, it brings it back onto course. And there's algorithms that help you do that. In real life, when you set a goal and you can visualize the goal and you can feel the goal and you can feel how it feels to achieve the goal, and you follow the feedback you're getting, you're actually giving yourself, and you're basically mapping your brain to success, seeing the same thing you're seeing, and seeing it from the aspects of a positive achievement of that goal. And it's almost like Gestalt. So when I got off that bus, I had no job. I didn't know what I was going to do, and but I was confident that whatever I did, I could. So my uncle was a fashion designer. He's from England as well. He just designed Margaret Trudeau, the Prime Minister's fiance's wedding clothes. He agreed to keep me at his home for a month while I was looking for a job. But I got a job in the telephone company. Again, they were looking for a technical person with some military background in terms of electronics, and I started in that role. So, not to get all tied up in so the book chronicles basically that growth, the changes in my career, the self-motivating learning kind of processes that I went through. I knew that I had to be more than I was in order to continue to achieve. So, on my summer holidays, I went across the country to Queen's University. I took an executive management course. I went to UBC in Vancouver to take courses in finance and for operations managers. So I took computer programming courses. During the course of doing all of this, I was one of 3 out of 10,000 employees that were selected to work on this brand new digital toll switch that the telephone was introducing. And for the next 2 years, we learned that system. We learned how to install it. We learned the software behind it. We learned it as though it was fundamental to me. I knew pretty well. I wanted to make sure that thing ever failed, that it wouldn't fail because of me. That it would be, that what I'd learned was sufficient enough for me to keep that system going, because we knew that there were customers that wouldn't have service if it wasn't working. And so again, building self-confidence, but also building an awareness of responsibility and accountability. The relationships so we get through the telephone period of my life into the cable side of my business, where people came to me interested in me becoming a manager within their small cable systems. And again, it was leading small groups of employees in a family setting with family values that really attracted me to what I thought was starting to fulfill, if you will, the kind of the vision that I had about being responsible for the growth of a company, all that entails, but also the security and for the employees in terms of an emotional environment that they could thrive in, that they could share in, and that the fact that they would lead as followers, that they would trust enough in me to follow me, went to one of the things I really thought was important as a leader was obviously trust, integrity, mentoring, and having the same ultimate goals as all of the people that we were leading. So where we were going, they were aware of where we were going, but we all shared, if you will, in the benefits of those achievements, and so that became a part of my value system, if you will. And ultimately, I ended up at Shaw, which was as the vice president of operations. And they hired me. They'd heard about me through, it's a small business in Canada, even though it's a huge country. They'd heard about me and they sought me out and hired me as a vice president of operations based on my reputation for getting things done, but getting things done in a way that was also something that people would embrace. So again, the softer skills, but also with a harder edge in terms of we were trying to grow, but we were trying to grow with integrity and all of the things that I learned through Maxwell Maltz, setting goals, sharing in the benefits of those, feeling that unbelievable good feeling that you get when you achieve things. And I became a bit of an advocate. I used to think of myself, maybe from my seminary days, as a kind of the good shepherd in terms of having a flock, but the flock was actually people that I was responsible for and accountable for, and sharing in all of the things we were trying to accomplish as a company with them. So, in fact, I was in bands with some of our employees. I used to play sports with some of our employees. I had a sense of, outside of the workplace too, what were the things that they, and basically street talk. We really like the way you treat us, Peter. And that's reinforcing as well. And so at the end of my career, and I'm going to sort of short through that because I know we've only got so much time, but in my book, my main motive for writing my book was as a legacy to pass on to my children's generations from now, about what was my grandpa, my great grandpa, why was he successful? What were his values? What were the things that he did in terms of meeting challenges that he faced in his life? How did he do certain things? What was going on in his life? And when technological change, I've been blessed, if you will, to be a part of the technological changes that have happened over the last 40 years. When you look at when I was in the Air Force, there was tube technology. When I graduated out of the Air Force, all of a sudden we're getting this large scale integration. And keeping pace with all of those technological changes as my career changed. I mean, I was in charge of engineering in Shaw and operations because my technical background had given me the capabilities to understand, kind of the things that we were trying to achieve. And so really enjoy the technological changes, but also be prepared to take them on. I mean, at Shaw, we would spend approximately $800 million a year to scale our network so that the services that we gave our customers could meet their expectations, whether it was high-speed internet, whether it was tons of digital channels, whether it was service when they call us. I used to call every week 20 customers. Give me a list of 20 customers, and I would phone them and say, "Hi, my name's Peter Bissonnette. I'm the president of Shaw, and how was our service today? How did the technician? How did we relate to you? Were there any things that we could have done better?" And they were going, "Are you really the president?" I cared about customers. I cared about our colleagues, and our values actually was funny. Our values that we espouse in our company were accountability, customer focus, et cetera, et cetera. But the one I said is missing is caring. Caring as a value basically underpins everything in our lives. If you care enough about our customer, if you care enough about a colleague, if you care enough about what the company is all about and the values of the company, wow, that's a tremendously positive, motivating kind of value. It captures them all. And then when you come home, caring works in your home life. Caring works in your personal lives. Caring works with raising your children. Because if you care enough, you're going to be accountable to do it right. And so I learned and I took from my experiences with Shaw and all of the other experiences I had in the most, I think I was even talked about, I said, to me, it was like eating fresh fruit and something good every day. It was nourishing me. It was making me better for my purpose in life, whatever that purpose was. And I believe my purpose in life was to lead with integrity, to lead people, and to, through the succession of successes, to share in the joy, if you will, of the kinds of things that we were engaged in. So that's the thumbnail, if you will, of Count on Me. And the word, the title, when it started off as a working title for my book, it was Have Faith in Yourself. And for a young child, I had faith in myself, and it grew through all of the things that I've talked about. I went to a course called Pacific Institute, and it was amazing when I thought back to what Maxwell Maltz said in his book, what he taught me. Lou Tice, who was a coach of football teams in the USA, was also a inspirational writer and leader. And the same kinds of things that Maxwell Maltz was talking about, he was talking about it subtly different, because it was all about sort of senior leadership and some of the tools that you have. I mean, we talked about scotomas. A scotoma is a blind spot. And we used to, at Shaw, I'd say, blind spots, obviously, if you're blind to them, you don't know that those are things that you may or may not be doing that have an effect on somebody, whether it's a positive one or a negative one. We used to have a psychological contract. We would say, everybody, you have permission. If I'm doing something that creates any kind of negative effect on you, you have my permission to provide me with that feedback. And you have my assurances that I will accept that feedback and I will learn from it, and you will see the results of that. So it was trying to help each other to be even more successful, more effective, by pointing out scotomas in a very constructive way. I mean, as you know, giving feedback sometimes can be a hard process to do in a very sensitive way, especially when you as soon as somebody gives you feedback, you kind of resist it. So Lou Tice talked about scotomas. He talks about the chameleon in management, being able to manage in all sorts of different environments, all sorts of different situations. I talked about in my book this situation, for instance, we were going to buy a company. We were a telecommunications company, and JR, our founder, he really wanted to have a media aspect to our business, because he thought that from media, branding, all of the positive things that you can do, we were kind of utilitarian nuts and bolts people with telecommunications. So he asked me he said, there's an opportunity to buy a company for $2 billion. Would you go to New York and represent our company? Because it was in the hands of bondholders. They were going bankrupt. And I remember going, holy doodle, I've never been to Toronto. I've never dealt with a bondholder. But yeah, I'll go if that's what you want. So I remember going to this meeting, and when I walked in, we had our lawyer and one of our very special acquisition people that worked with me. So three of us, we went to this meeting, and there was about 100 to 150 people in there, plus the trustee who was dealing with this bankruptcy. And he was going around the table asking people why they were there, what they were trying to achieve. And so when he came around to me, the bondholders had come into the meeting, and they were kind of ignoring what was going on. They were talking to each other, kind of giggling. And anyway, when I started to talk, and I said, the reason I'm here today is I'm representing Shaw, and we're here but as I was talking, this person from the bondholder was basically ignoring me, talking to this person. And I stopped the conversation, and I said, Jerry, I had a dream about you last night. And he kind of looked at me, and I said, yeah, I actually gave you a hug. And he looked at me again. I said, I gave you a hug because you and I agreed that you're going to sell me that company and we're going to buy it. You're going to be pleased with the outcome, and so am I. So rather than grandstanding in this office, why don't you and I just go out to the outside and just have a totally honest conversation about what is keeping us apart from that hug? And the whole room. So it was a non-traditional way of doing some things. But anyway, ultimately, we agreed we couldn't do it right now. But within 3 months, I called him up to give him a virtual hug, because we'd bought that company. And our needs were met. His needs were met. I had still felt uncomfortable going through the process, and it was an unfamiliar process. But one of the things I've always been prepared to do is get out of my comfort zone and step into something because of the self-talk, the ability to visualize an outcome, good old Maxwell models, and the sort of the gestalt, the feeling that that has. When we left having
Mm.
bought the company, we went to the Olympics in Vancouver in 2010. And JR, our founder, when I walked into this room, it was the feeling that he gave me, Peter, I cannot believe that you and our team, because it wasn't just me, were able to achieve what I've always dreamt we wanted to have as part of this company. And it was like the conquering hero. I thought, what? Can't describe how it was, but from being sort of questioning whether or not this is the right thing to do, all of the kind of hurdles we have to go through to get to it, and to have the owner of our company, the founder, acknowledge what we had done. That was that feeling that Maxwell Maltz said. Visualize the feeling as well, and so that's one
Mm.
example from my book, Count on Me, that really reinforces that the whole aspect of mindfulness, integrity, trust, and as we being a way of being, if you will. People looked at
Love it.
me as somebody they trusted, and I looked at them as people I trust too. And so it to me it was worthwhile basically chronicling that in my book, because I hope someday that the letter I just received today from somebody who just read my book saying, I can't believe how I couldn't put the book down. I was so proud because 10 years ago we worked together. You brought me back to the feelings I had when we were with Shaw and how wonderful those were. That was feedback that made it all worthwhile.
Mm. I bet. Wow. It's a powerful, powerful book with lots of insights from your life. And I love reference to psychocybernetics, as I was saying. Sorry, let me say that again. Psychocybernetics is by Maxwell Malt, which is a really, really powerful book, and the power of identity. Sounds like there's a lot of lessons for the listener from your book about how they can build confidence using what you've gone through, and how I can really sort of like own their identity and use the power of visualization, as you were saying. And yeah, it sounds really exciting for when the book's coming out. So yeah, Peter, where can the listener find your book? And it's out in July, right?
Yes, July the 18th. Our
Yeah.
public our publisher is ingeniumbooks.com, INGENIUM books.com. And
Mm.
if you there's also on that website, there's a ingeniumbooks.com slash Peter Bissonnette as the author, along with
Mm.
Lucy Linsky, who also happens to come from England, who worked with me and collaborated on this book as well. And so between the two of us, we've captured, I hope, something that future readers will enjoy. I hope that they take some, as I say, it's not a textbook, but there's ways of achieving things that are transferable
Mm.
in everybody's life. There's nothing bad about goods. And if you can, I model myself after people that I really respected, and
Mm.
I've modeled myself after people that I cherished as as both mentors as well as models how to live. And I'm hoping that in this book that you being the reader can find something as well. I know there's something in there for everybody. So
Oh, amazing. Yeah, we'll be sure to link that book up so the listener can grab a copy of it and take some even more. We've only touched the surface today, but had absolute gold today. But taking some even more golden nuggets and things away for their life. So yeah, Peter, thank you for what you've done with the book, and thank you for everything you've been able to share with us today on today's
well,
episode.
thanks, Johnny. And anytime if we'd like to chat again, because as I said, this is one of those things that you just can't get enough of in terms of the
Yeah.
messages of lives. And I've watched you, and similarly, I go, wow, there's a person with a purpose, and I love that purpose.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. So that concludes our episode for today. And remember to lead with your heart and not with fear.